All right, welcome back. And today we are going to continue on and do day 2 of the nervous system. And today we are learning all about synapses. So synapses are basically the places where the two neurons connect. And before we do that, I want you to just review your notes from last class. What are the main structures of a neuron? So figure that out. And then hopefully you said 3 main structures that we learned about. There are the dendrites, which receive the chemical signal from what we call the presynaptic neuron, which we'll learn about today. Then we have the soma, which is the cell body, which has the nucleus, any of the organelles, and then we have the axon, which is basically how the electrical signal travels. Cool. Okay. So, guiding questions. What is a synapse and how do neurons send signals to each other? That's what you're going to learn today. You come up with this. Why is it important for our brain to send and receive signals? And then I thought this meme was really funny and I thought it kind of applied to me. You have 86 billion neurons in your brain and we make memes. Ha 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 ha. Okay. So this is like a little bit of review. You don't necessarily need to write this unless you feel like you need to, of what is a nerve impulse, what is a nerve signal that you're sending. This is just for you to remember. Neurons are sending signals through action potentials. So we learned all about the action potential last class with the sodium-potassium pump, and mainly sodium being outside of the cell, potassium being inside. And when you send an electrical signal, they switch places really quickly and then slowly go back to normal so that you can send another signal. These action potentials, they have to have some way of moving from one neuron to the next. Because when I talked to you guys last class, we only talked about in the case of one neuron, right? So how is that electrical signal getting sent from this neuron to the next one so that it can travel all the way up to your brain and then your brain can send a signal all the way back? So that's kind of what we're talking about today. This is where synapses come into play and why synapses are really important. So let's just jump right in. What is a synapse? A synapse is the physical gap, and this always really interested me because neurons actually do not touch ever. They do not touch. So synapses are literal physical gaps that are like micrometers in length. They're extremely small, but they are physical gaps that separate neurons from other cells. And they separate neurons from other neurons or other types of cells. And neurons are transmitting the information across the synapses by basically they convert the electrical signal that we talked all about last class into a chemical signal that can then go to the next cell and the next neuron. And the next neuron takes that chemical signal, converts it back to an electrical signal. The electrical signal travels down the neuron and you can see the chain kind of repeats itself. If you look here, that's why this is a great drawing. So we have the presynaptic cell. This is the cell that's sending the signal, and the action potential that we learned about last class with that sodium and potassium pump is going to be traveling all the way down that axon, and then eventually it reaches this part. This is the synapse. This is where the axon of one neuron meets this dendrite of the next neuron, and as you can see there's a little tiny space there. They do not touch, and then that is where the electrical signal will be converted to chemical, and then the dendrite will accept that chemical signal, convert it back to an electrical signal, and the action potential will continue down this neuron, and basically the chain will keep repeating itself. We call this one the postsynaptic neuron because it's the receiving cell. If you think about just like the prefix presynaptic before the synapse, there's the synapse, and then postsynaptic after the synapse. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Okay, so how does a synapse work? So this is actually like the only notes you have today. It's very short. So make sure you are kind of paying attention and figure this out and ask me questions if you have any questions. And I'm also going to show a picture of this next. So if you're more of a picture person, hold out for that as well. So first thing, basically an action potential travels down the axon, and when it reaches the end of the axon, it basically triggers the opening of calcium channels. And then some calcium ions are going to diffuse into the cell, and they lead to the fusion of vesicles that contain neurotransmitters with the cell membrane. The picture will help with this in a second. Those neurotransmitters are then going to be released from the end of the axon by exocytosis, and they travel along that physical gap, that physical synapse that we talked about, and reach the dendrite of the next neuron. They then bind to specific receptors on that postsynaptic membrane, on that next neuron, and open up ion channels. And then the opening of those ion channels basically generates that electrical impulse in the new neuron, and it causes the signal to then continue moving down the chain of neurons. So it's basically just a chain reaction. It's going from an electrical signal to a chemical signal that crosses the synapse, back to an electrical signal, then back to a chemical signal, crosses the synapse, then back to an electrical signal. And it just is a continued chain of reactions until that signal reaches where it needs to go, which is usually the brain. And then last but not least, the neurotransmitters that were released into the synapse are either going to be recycled by what we call reuptake pumps, or degraded, meaning broken down by enzymes. Now, here is an image of this, which I think helps a ton because it numbers each step with what's actually happening. So step 1, that action potential that we learned about last class, is basically traveling all the way down that axon. So we see here that action potential is traveling down the axon, traveling down that cell membrane, because we know it's about the movement of the sodium potassium. And then when it reaches the end of the axon, it causes this calcium channel to open. And when that calcium channel opens, calcium that was outside the cell moves into the cell. That's step 3. See, calcium enters the presynaptic neuron. And then step 4, the calcium basically signals to neurotransmitter vesicles. So step 4, it's going to signal for these neurotransmitter vesicles to kind of jump into action. 5, the vesicles move to the membrane and they say dock. So basically they move to the membrane and they release their neurotransmitter. That's step 6, right? That neurotransmitter gets released, and we see this is that physical gap that I talked about of the synapse, where the axon of this neuron is not touching the dendrite of the next. Instead, they just have this physical gap. Those neurotransmitters, it opens up, neurotransmitters are released. And then here we see step 7, the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor. And then step 8, basically that then causes the electrical impulse, that action potential, to continue moving down the neuron. And then it goes to the next neuron and it keeps going through that chain reaction. So this picture might be a really good one to just like kind of summarize your notes. Okay, and then last but not least, I just wanted to talk for a second about what is a neurotransmitter, and this is kind of going to tie into your final activity for the week. So neurotransmitters are often called the body's chemical messengers. They basically transmit signals across a synapse from one neuron to another target cell, and they can impact your physical and psychological functions. You've probably heard of a lot of these neurotransmitters before. I'm sure you've heard of serotonin, you've heard of dopamine, you might have heard of acetylcholine, you might have heard of melatonin, you might have heard of, I'm trying to think of all the ones that I want you guys to learn about. Oh, you've definitely heard of adrenaline or epinephrine, right? So those are all neurotransmitters, and you know a lot of those chemicals impact your physical and psychological functions. So basically your activity to finalize the week is to complete the linked Google form where you're going to explore the functions of 7 different neurotransmitters. And then that's it. I don't have an exit ticket for this topic because it's a little bit difficult to teach virtually for sure. But I'd rather you explore some of the functions of 7 different neurotransmitters and know what they do than do an exit ticket. So finish that finish that assignment. Tell me the main functions of those 7 neurotransmitters, and then please log on to office hours this week and say hello, ask me any questions. I'd love to help y'all with this topic and just to see your awesome smiley faces. I hope you guys are having a great week and staying safe. Bye.